That night was the craziest yet most exciting night of my whole life. It was a quiet Tuesday when it happened. The kind of night where everything seemed so peaceful that it lulled you into a deep sense of security. I had been exhausted from work more than usual, and I welcomed the idea of sleep with open arms. I didn't have to worry about anything once my head hit the pillow, or so I thought. I've been a single mom for the last 8 years, ever since my ex-husband and I divorced. Our relationship wasn't toxic, but we simply grew apart. Raising my son, Jamie, alone had been both the greatest joy and the hardest challenge of my life. He was everything to me: smart, funny, and always kind, but the demands of being both mother and father wore me down at times. That night, exhaustion had set in early, and I barely had the energy to change into my pajamas before collapsing into bed. The house was quite quiet. Jamie had gone to bed a few hours earlier after a night of video games and homework, and I felt relieved to have a moment of solitude. My room was dark, except for the faint glow of the moonlight that filtered through the thin curtains. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, sinking into the warmth and comfort of my bed. As I lay in bed, the soft glow of the moon casting faint shadows on the walls, my body curled beneath the covers. I was thinking about life. It had been peaceful lately, which was a relief after everything that had happened in the past year. Jamie and I had been through a lot together. After his father left, it had just been the two of us, figuring out life on our own terms. Even though Jamie was almost 20 years old now, we still shared a close bond. He was always thoughtful, always caring, and sometimes I wondered if he took on too much responsibility for a boy his age. I smiled softly at the thought of him. He had such a big heart, and I felt lucky to have him in my life. But tonight, I was too tired to think much about anything. My eyes were heavy, my body relaxed, and I was ready to surrender to sleep when I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. I stirred, groggy, half dreaming as I listened. The knock came again, gentle but insistent, pulling me out of the haze of sleep. "Mom." Jamie's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to wake me fully. I blinked, trying to focus, and glanced toward the door. The light in the hallway was dim, casting a faint outline of Jamie standing in the doorway. I propped myself up on my elbows, blinking away the sleep. "Jamie, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice thick with drowsiness. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside the room, closing the door quietly behind him. There was something about the way he moved so tentative, as if he wasn't sure whether he should be there at all. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly. Avoiding my gaze as he stood by the foot of the bed, I felt a pang of concern. Jamie had been having trouble sleeping for a while now. Ever since the divorce, he never said it outright, but I knew he struggled with the changes in our lives. His father's absence had hit him harder than he let on, and sometimes, on nights like this, I could see the weight of it in his eyes. "Come here," I said gently, patting the space beside me. "You can stay with me tonight if you want." He hesitated again, just for a moment, before walking over and climbing into bed next to me. He lay on his side, facing me, and for the first time, I saw the weariness in his expression. There was something else to something that flickered behind his eyes, a quiet vulnerability that he didn't show very often. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Jamie shook his head, his dark hair falling into his eyes. "No, I just wanted to be close to you." My heart softened. It had been a long time since Jamie had come to me like this, seeking comfort the way he used to when he was younger. I reached out, brushing the hair back from his forehead, and smiled softly. "That's okay," I whispered. "You can stay as long as you need." He smiled back, but there was still that flicker of something deeper in his eyes, something he wasn't ready to say yet. I didn't push him. Instead, I lay back, pulling the blanket up over both of us, and let the silence settle around us. For a while, we just lay there, the quiet of the room wrapping us in its embrace. Jamie's breathing began to slow, becoming deep and even, and I thought he had fallen asleep. But then, in the softest voice, he spoke again. "Mom, do you ever miss him?" The question caught me off guard, but I didn't need to ask who he meant. I knew Jamie was talking about his father. It was a question I had been avoiding for a long time, one I wasn't sure how to answer. "I do sometimes," I admitted it, my voice just as soft. "But things weren't good between us. Jamie, you know that." He nodded, but his eyes remained focused on me, waiting for more. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" I sighed, my heart heavy with the weight of the past. "Maybe ... we can't change what happened. All we can do is move forward." Jamie looked down, his fingers playing with the edge of the blanket. "I guess. I just wonder if I could have done something different. You know? If maybe I had been better ... His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I sat up, turning to face him fully. "Jamie, no, you didn't do anything wrong. None of this was your fault. But sometimes it feels like it is ... double quotes," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "like if I had just been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I reached out, pulling him into my arms. He resisted for a moment, but then he let himself relax into the embrace, burying his face in my shoulder. "Jamie, listen to me," I said, my voice trembling. "Your dad's leaving had nothing to do with you. He made his choices, and those choices were not your responsibility. You've always been more than enough. Okay, you're my everything." He nodded against my shoulder, but I could feel the tension in his body. He had been carrying this weight for too long, and I hadn't realized just how deeply it had affected him. We stayed like that for a while, just holding each other, and slowly, I felt the tension begin to ease. Jamie's breathing became steadier, and after a few minutes, I could tell he was drifting off to sleep. I stayed awake, though, my mind racing with thoughts of the past, of all the things we had both been through. But there was something else to something I hadn't expected. As I held Jamie close, I felt a warmth spread through me, not just the warmth of a mother's love for her son, but something deeper, something more. It was a feeling I couldn't quite name, something that both comforted and unsettled me at the same time. I tried to push it away, tried to focus on the steady rhythm of Jamie's breathing, but the feeling lingered, hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And as I lay there in the darkness, holding my son close, I realized that things were changing between us, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant. And this only felt like a beginning. The next morning came too quickly, the early sunlight creeping through the curtains and waking me before I was ready to face the day. Jamie was still asleep beside me, his face peaceful, the tension that had weighed him down the night before now gone. I watched him for a moment, my heart swelling with the familiar warmth of maternal love, but underneath it, something else lingered. It was that same feeling I had tried to push away the night before, the feeling I couldn't quite name. I slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake him, and headed downstairs to make breakfast. As I stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, my mind wandered back to the conversation we'd had in the middle of the night. Jamie had always been sensitive, but I hadn't realized just how much he had internalized about his father's departure. The guilt he felt was something I should have seen earlier, and the fact that he hadn't shared it with me until now weighed heavily on my heart. But there was more to it than that. There was a shift in the way he had looked at me last night, the way he had sought comfort in my arms. It was as if he had crossed a line between needing me as his mother and seeking something more, something closer, deeper, and the truth was, I had felt it too. The warmth that spread through me when I held him, the way his presence comforted me, wasn't just about maternal protection. It was something else. I shook the thought away, focusing on the pancakes. "He's just a boy," I reminded myself, "your son." But no matter how much I tried to push it aside, the feeling lingered. Jamie finally came downstairs, rubbing his eyes, his hair tousled from sleep. He looked more like a kid again in that moment, his lanky frame still adjusting to his teenage growth spurt. I smiled, trying to shake off the strange emotions from the night before. "Morning, sleepyhead," I greeted him, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. "Morning," he mumbled, sitting down and digging into his breakfast. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting the kitchen in a warm, golden glow. I could feel Jamie glancing at me now and then, but I didn't say anything. I wasn't ready to bring up the conversation from the night before. He seemed better this morning, more like himself, and I didn't want to stir up any lingering emotions unless he was ready. Finally, Jamie broke the silence. "Thanks for last night, Mom. I needed that." I looked up at him, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his voice. "You don't have to thank me, Jamie. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." He nodded, but his eyes remained focused on me, waiting for more. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" I sighed, my heart heavy with the weight of the past. "Maybe, but we can't change what happened. All we can do is move forward." Jamie looked down, his fingers playing with the edge of the blanket. "I guess I just wonder if I could have done something different. You know, if maybe I had been better." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I sat up, turning to face him fully. "Jamie, no, you didn't do anything wrong. None of this was your fault, but sometimes it feels like it is," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Like if I had just been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I reached out, pulling him into my arms. He resisted for a moment, but then he let himself relax into the embrace, burying his face in my shoulder. "Jamie, listen to me," I said, my voice trembling. "Your dad's leaving had nothing to do with you. He made his choices, and those choices were not your responsibility. You've always been more than enough, okay? You're my everything." He nodded against my shoulder, but I could feel the tension in his body. He had been carrying this weight for too long, and I hadn't realized just how deeply it had affected him. We stayed like that for a while, just holding each other, and slowly I felt the tension begin to ease. Jaime's breathing became steadier, and after a few minutes, I could tell he was drifting off to sleep. I stayed awake, though, my mind racing with thoughts of the past, of all the things we had both been through, but there was something else too, something I hadn't expected. As I held Jaime close, I felt a warmth spread through me, not just the warmth of a mother's love for her son, but something deeper, something more. It was a feeling I couldn't quite name, something that both comforted and unsettled me at the same time. I tried to push it away, tried to focus on the steady rhythm of Jaime's breathing, but the feeling lingered, hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And as I lay there in the darkness, holding my son close, I realized that things were changing between us. But I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant, and this only felt like a beginning. The next morning came too quickly, the early sunlight creeping through the curtains and waking me before I was ready to face the day. Jaime was still asleep beside me, his face peaceful, the weight that had weighed him down the night before now gone. I watched him for a moment, my heart swelling with the familiar warmth of maternal love, but underneath it, something else lingered. It was that same feeling I had tried to push away the night before, the feeling I couldn't quite name. I slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake him, and headed downstairs to make breakfast. As I stood at the stove flipping pancakes, my mind wandered back to the conversation we'd had in the middle of the night. Jaime had always been sensitive, but I hadn't realized just how much he had internalized about his father's departure. The guilt he felt was something I should have seen earlier, and the fact that he hadn't shared it with me until now weighed heavily on my heart. But there was more to it than that. There was a shift in the way he had looked at me last night, the way he had sought comfort in my arms. It was as if he had crossed a line between needing me as his mother and seeking something more, something closer, deeper ... And the truth was, I had felt it too. The warmth that spread through me when I held him, the way his presence comforted me, wasn't just about maternal protection. It was something else. I shook the thought away, focusing on the pancakes. He's just a boy, I reminded myself. Your son, but no matter how much I tried to push it aside, the feeling lingered. Jaime finally came downstairs, rubbing his eyes, his hair tousled from sleep. He looked more like a kid again in that moment, his lanky frame still adjusting to his teenage growth spurt. I smiled, trying to shake off the strange emotions from the night before. Morning, sleepyhead, I greeted him, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. Morning, he mumbled, sitting down and digging into his breakfast. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting the kitchen in a warm golden glow. I could feel Jaime glancing at me now and then, but I didn't say anything. I wasn't ready to bring up the conversation from the night before. He seemed better this morning, more like himself, and I didn't want to stir up any lingering emotions unless he was ready. Finally, Jamie broke the silence. Thanks for last night. Mom, I needed that. I looked up at him, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his voice. You don't have to thank me, Jamie. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. He nodded, but there was something deeper in his eyes. Something that reminded me of the way he had looked at me in the dark when he thought I couldn't see him. His gaze lingered a little longer than usual, and for a moment, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The day passed uneventfully. Jamie spent most of his time upstairs doing homework or playing video games, and I busied myself with house chores. But the atmosphere between us had shifted. It was subtle, nothing overt, nothing I could point to and say, there, that's different. But it was there a quiet tension, an unspoken understanding. As the day turned into evening, I found myself thinking about Jamie more and more. I thought about how he had grown so much in the last few years, how he was becoming his own person. But more than that, I thought about the closeness we had shared last night, how natural it had felt to hold him, to comfort him, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my feelings weren't just those of a mother, they were something more. That night, after dinner, Jamie and I sat together on the couch watching a movie. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the television casting flickering shadows across the walls. We didn't talk much. Both of us seemed content just to be in each other's presence. But as the movie went on, I became increasingly aware of how close Jamie was sitting to me, how his arm brushed against mine whenever he shifted. My heart raced, and I tried to focus on the movie, but it was no use. The tension between us was palpable, even though neither of us said a word about it. Every movement felt charged with unspoken emotion, and the longer we sat there, the harder it became to ignore. Halfway through the movie, Jamie shifted closer to me, his arm brushing against mine again. This time, he didn't move away. Instead, he let his arm rest against mine, the warmth of his skin sending a rush of heat through me. I glanced over at him, and he looked back at me, his eyes soft but filled with something I hadn't seen before. It was a look of affection. Yes, but also something deeper, something that mirrored the emotions I had been trying to suppress all day. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand in mine, our fingers intertwining. Jamie didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed my hand gently, his thumb brushing over my skin in a way that made my heart flutter. We sat like that for a while, neither of us speaking, just holding hands in the dim light of the living room. It felt like a turning point, a moment where something shifted between us. I didn't know what it meant yet, and I wasn't ready to examine it too closely, but I knew deep down that things were changing. Jamie wasn't just my son anymore. He was something more, someone I cared about in a way that went beyond maternal love. The movie ended, but we stayed on the couch, the credits rolling on the screen. I leaned my head against Jamie's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. It was a small gesture, but it felt intimate, more intimate than anything we had shared before. Mom, Jamie said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Yeah, I am really glad you're here. I don't know what I'd do without you. My heart swelled with emotion, and I squeezed his hand again. I'm glad I'm here too, Jamie, and you don't ever have to worry about losing me. I'm not going anywhere, he smiled softly, and for a moment, we just sat there, wrapped in the quiet warmth of the moment. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling of connection, of belonging, of love. But this wasn't the kind of love I had always known. It was something deeper, something new. I didn't realize it at that moment yet, but now I look back at it. It was intimate love, back then already, and as I lay there, resting against Jamie's shoulder, I realized that whatever was happening between us was growing rapidly. Although, surprisingly enough, it didn't really bother me. Actually, it was quite exciting. And I definitely couldn't tell why. The days following that night on the couch were different. Jamie and I moved around the house in what felt like a carefully choreographed dance. Our routine, the same, but the air between us was charged with something new. There was a warmth in the way we moved around each other, like an invisible tether that kept drawing us closer, pulling us into each other's orbit. I tried to keep things normal, tried to shake the feelings that had stirred within me. But I couldn't ignore what had happened. I couldn't forget the way his hand had felt in mine, the way his touch lingered on my skin. It had been so small, so innocent on the surface, but it had meant everything, and the more time passed, the more I realized I didn't want to forget. The connection between us was undeniable, and with each passing day, it became harder to pretend that nothing had changed. Jamie seemed to feel it too. I noticed how he would watch me when he thought I wasn't looking, how his eyes lingered on me a little longer, how he always seemed to find excuses to be close to me. One evening, a few days after our quiet moment on the couch, we were cleaning up after dinner. Jamie was drying the dishes while I washed them, the steady rhythm of our work filling the kitchen with a peaceful quiet. The evening sun filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow over the room, making everything feel soft, like we were wrapped in a dream. I handed Jamie a plate, our fingers brushing as he took it from me. The brief contact sent a familiar warmth through me, and I glanced up at him, catching his eyes as he looked at me with that same gentle intensity I had seen before. You okay, Mom? He asked, his voice low but filled with a softness that made my heart ache. Yeah, I'm fine, I replied, smiling at him, just thinking about what ... I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. I didn't want to lie to him, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to be completely honest either about us. I said quietly, deciding to be vague but truthful. Jamie didn't look away. Instead, he set the dish down on the counter and turned to face me fully, his eyes searching mine. What about us? My heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't meant for the conversation to go in this direction, but now that we were here, there was no turning back. The tension between us hung in the air, heavy and thick, like the quiet before a storm. I don't know, I whispered. It just feels like things have changed. Jamie stepped closer, his body just inches from mine now, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the steady rhythm of our breathing. He reached out gently, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch sending shivers down my spine. They have changed, he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. But that's not a bad thing, is it? I looked up at him, my heart racing. The way he looked at me with such tenderness, such care, it was overwhelming. My mind was spinning. But all I could think about was how close he was, how much I wanted to close the small distance between us and let myself fall into whatever this was. I don't know, I said honestly. I don't know what this is. Jamie's hand lingered by my face, his fingers lightly grazing my cheek. I think it's just us, he whispered. It's just you and me. I took a deep breath, leaning into his touch for just a moment, letting the warmth of his hand soothe the storm inside me. For so long, it had been just the two of us, navigating the world together, leaning on each other. Our bond had always been strong, but now it felt like it was evolving, becoming something more than what either of us had expected. When I opened my eyes, Jamie was still watching me, his expression soft but full of emotion. Mom, double quotes he hesitated, his voice catching in his throat. I don't know how to explain it, but I care about you. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone. His words made my heart skip a beat, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The emotions that had been building inside me for days, weeks even, came rushing to the surface all at once, overwhelming me with their intensity. I had been trying to hold them back, trying to keep them in check, but now, standing so close to Jamie with his hand on my cheek, and his eyes full of love, I couldn't deny it anymore. I care about you too, I whispered, my voice trembling, more than you know. Jamie's eyes softened even further, and for a moment, we just stood there, frozen in time. The world outside the kitchen faded away. All that existed was the space between us, the connection that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Then, slowly, I leaned into him. I noticed he leaned toward me as well, and I put my leg over his. I kissed him, and he definitely did not hold back. I couldn't hold it anymore, and I think he couldn't too. His lips brushing mine in the most gentle yet intimate kiss was the best I had ever felt. It was full of excitement, a powerful expression of the love that had been building between us. The moment went from bad to worse, and before I knew it, everything was happening. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. This wasn't wrong, it wasn't confusing. It was love, pure and simple, and it was the kind of love that had grown naturally between us, blossoming out of years of care, trust, and understanding. That's what I told myself while we were busy. After half an hour, Jamie decided it was over, and we laid there, both slowly realizing what just happened. When Jamie pulled back, he smiled at me, his eyes full of warmth. We're okay. Right. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. My heart was full, too overwhelmed by everything I was feeling. Yeah, I whispered, we're okay, that night, after we finished cleaning up. Jamie and I sat together on the back porch, watching the stars. The night was quiet, the air cool and crisp, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The weight of the unspoken emotions between us had lifted, and in its place was a sense of calm, a sense of peace. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. Just sitting beside each other, sharing the quiet of the night, was enough. There was no rush, no pressure. Whatever this was between us, it was evolving at its own pace, and I was content to let it unfold naturally. Jamie reached over and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. I smiled, squeezing his hand gently, and we sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars twinkle above us. It was love, tangible, real, and more powerful than I had ever expected. And as I sat there beside Jamie, holding his hand under the blanket of the night sky, I knew that, whatever came next, we would face it together. As the days turned into weeks, the quiet intimacy Jamie and I shared became a part of our daily lives. We didn't need to talk about it much. Whatever was growing between us didn't need labels. It just was. It flowed between us naturally in the way we looked at each other, the way we found reasons to touch, the way we shared those quiet, lingering moments that were ours and ours alone. But with each day that passed, I could feel the connection between us deepening, becoming more tangible, more real, and I no longer felt conflicted about it. Jamie wasn't just my son anymore. He had become my partner in a way I hadn't expected. It was as if our relationship had transformed into something that fit both of us perfectly, something we hadn't even known we needed. It wasn't until a rainy afternoon in late autumn that everything finally came into focus. The sky was dark, thick clouds swirling overhead, and the rain tapped steadily against the windows, filling the house with the calming sound of nature. Jamie and I were sitting in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the fireplace as we sat together on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. The warmth of the fire mixed with the coziness of the moment, and I could feel the pull between us growing stronger. Jamie was leaning against me, his head resting on my shoulder, and I absently ran my fingers through his hair, enjoying the quiet closeness we shared. There was something about the way the rain blurred the outside world, the way the fire made the room feel like our own little universe, that made everything seem more intimate, more intense. I could feel Jamie's breathing slow and steady, and I knew without words that he was thinking the same thing I was. The unspoken emotions between us had grown so strong that it felt like we didn't even need to speak anymore. We were perfectly in sync, perfectly aligned. Jamie lifted his head slightly, turning to look at me, and our eyes met for a long moment. We just stared at each other. The room filled with the soft glow of the fire and the steady beat of the rain, and in that moment, I knew that what we shared wasn't just love. It was something deeper, something that went beyond the simple label of mother and son. It was a bond that had evolved into something tangible, something real. "Mom," Jamie whispered, his voice low but full of emotion. I didn't respond, just waited for him to continue, knowing that whatever he was about to say was important. "I love you," he said softly, his hand reaching out to take mine. "Not just because you're my mom, but because of who you are, everything about you. And I don't know if that's okay or if it's wrong, but I can't help it." His words washed over me, filling the room with a warmth that made my heart ache in the best way possible. I had known this was coming. I had felt it too, but hearing him say it out loud, admitting the depth of his feelings, made everything feel more real. I squeezed his hand, feeling the steady pulse of his heartbeat beneath my fingertips. "Jamie," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly, "I love you too. I've always loved you, but this ... this is different." He nodded, his eyes searching mine as if looking for reassurance, for some kind of answer to the question that hung between us. "I don't know what this means," I continued, "but I know that I feel the same way, and it doesn't feel wrong to me. It feels like ... like it's just right." Jamie's face softened, and he smiled, a small, gentle smile that made my heart swell with emotion. "I'm glad," he whispered. "Glad you feel that way, because I don't know what I'd do if you didn't." I reached up, brushing my fingers along his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my hand. "We'll figure this out," I said quietly, "together." For a long moment, we just sat there, holding each other's gaze. The room filled with the soft sound of the rain and the crackling of the fire. There was no need for words. Everything had already been said. We both knew what we felt, and we both knew that it was real, tangible. Jamie leaned forward slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, and gently, hesitantly, he pressed his lips to mine. It was a soft, tender kiss, full of all the love and emotion we had been holding back for so long. There was no urgency, no rush, just the simple, pure expression of everything we felt for each other. When he pulled back, his eyes were full of emotion, and I knew that we had crossed a line that we could never go back from. But instead of feeling afraid, I felt at peace. It was as if this was where we were always meant to end up, and now that we were here, everything else in the world faded away. Jamie pulled me closer, wrapping his arms around me, and we sat there together, holding each other as the rain continued to fall outside. The fire flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the room, and in that moment, I knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of quiet conversation, gentle touches, and soft kisses. We didn't talk about what the future held, or what this new chapter in our relationship would mean. We didn't need to. All that mattered was the present, this moment, here and now, where we could just be with each other. As the rain continued to fall outside, I found myself thinking about how much had changed between us in such a short amount of time. Jamie had grown from a boy into a man, and in doing so, our relationship had transformed into something I hadn't expected, but something I had come to embrace. That night, Jamie came into my room again, But this time, there was no hesitation. He climbed into bed beside me, wrapping his arms around me, holding me close. It wasn't like the other nights, where he sought comfort or reassurance. This time, it felt like we were equals, like we had found something between us that was stronger than anything else in the world. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely and utterly content. Whatever this was, whatever it had become, I was ready for it. Jamie and I had always been close, but now we were something more. We were partners in the truest sense of the word, and I knew that no matter what the world threw at us, we would face it together. As I drifted off to sleep, I smiled softly to myself. It was crazy to realize all of this, but I didn't care about anyone's opinions, and it made me feel amazing.